Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 FM, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Cherokee land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
This week, we share an interview I conducted a few months back with two folks, Inman and Bleep, about community armed self-defense. They talk about their experiences of handling firearms, lessons learned from their visibly armed presence at the Charlottesville Unite The Right protest in 2017, wider ideas of community self-defense beyond open carrying firearms, for instance engaging in infrastructure for food and health autonomy. The guests also talk about skills expanded and muscles flexed in Appalachian and Southern participation in autonomous disaster relief in the last few years. Some resources and ideas to keep in mind or steal if your group is thinking about training in firearms or medicing, and more. There's a lot cut from the radio edition, so if you're listening live, we suggest you check out the online edition at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, where you can stream any of our shows and subscribe to our podcast if you'd like. If you're in Asheville on Sunday, June 2nd, you can join Blue Ridge ABC for their monthly political prisoner letter writing night from 5 to 7 p.m. at Firestorm Books. No experience is required. Also on Friday, June 7th, from 6:30 to 8 p.m. instead of Trouble, BRABC will be showing the documentary The Bail Trap and having a discussion about it afterwards. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a what?
I want bad things to happen to bad people. I hope for bad things to happen to bad people, and I celebrate when those bad things occur. I clap and cheer. I get downright euphoric. I haven't always been like this. Growing up, I was trained by family to always conduct myself in a very reserved manner, and to never celebrate the misfortune of anyone, not even bad people. To celebrate the evils that befall others makes us bad people. That's how I was trained. It hasn't been easy to break that training, but it has been necessary. As a simple matter of intellectual honesty, I think we all have to admit that we like bad things happening to bad people. We may not all agree as to who the bad people are. My idea of the bad people might just be your people, or you. And your idea of the bad people might just be my people, or me. How we identify and designate who is bad is irrelevant. Whoever they are, we want bad stuff to happen to them, and we should. It only makes sense. To make a sports analogy, if my favorite team scores, I cheer. I feel happy. If their opponent scores, I get quiet and moody. I grumble. In this sports analogy, I don't respond with equanimity no matter who scores. When good occurs to my team, to the detriment of their opposition, I'm glad. And when bad happens to them to the benefit of their opposition, I'm distraught. So, as in sports fandom, so also in life. I want my team to win. I want them to score. I want them to defeat the opposition. I want the opposition to fumble, to strike out, to fail catastrophically. And when they do, I celebrate. In life, my team is my chosen tribe. The opposing team is the competitor, the enemy of my tribe. They're all inherently bad. And we know they're inherently bad because I don't like them. If they weren't inherently bad, I'd like them. Okay, so having gotten this far, I think it's clear that we should hope for strokes, heart attacks, plane wrecks, and pancreatic cancer to happen to bad people. And when those events happen, we should really be glad about them. When my sentencing judge got voted out of office shortly after engineering my false conviction, I was all high fives. When the prosecutor got exposed by his brother as being a coke dealer, I was all happy dances. When the parole board members who continue burning my life down get fired or get arrested, I'm a walking pizza party. The deaths of sociopaths and scumbags like Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia or former presidents like Nixon, Bush the Elder, and Bush the Younger are causes for celebration. Wait, Bush the Younger is still alive. Come on, rectal cancer. And it's not just about being a hater. It's not. I have a theory of how the universe operates. I think it's self-evident that there's a certain quantum of bad that happens in the world. Tomorrow, for instance, there will be a certain quantum of intoxicated drivers crashing into others. There will be a certain quantum of people getting diagnosed with mesothelioma. A certain quantum of people losing limbs or appendages in lawnmower or meat slicer accidents. A certain quantum of kids killed by oversucking pool drains. These are evils that are going to happen. That's the world we live in. More recently, I've seen on the news that there's been an upswing of planes falling onto people's homes, for instance. I don't want my parents to get hit by a plane while sitting in their living room, or my friends. I don't want that certain quantum of bad, of evil in the world to be distributed to them. I would prefer that those I love be somewhat insulated from the evils of drunk drivers and mesothelioma diagnoses, from lawnmower accidents and deadly pool drains, and planes falling onto people's homes. I want that stuff to happen to evil, rotten people like Dick Cheney. The more that drunk drivers crash into Dick Cheney, the fewer drunk drivers there are to crash into my loved ones, or to the bands I like, or to the movie stars whose movies I'd like to watch. If Dick Cheney gets a foot chopped off by a lawnmower, or his lung tissue turns to leather, or his fat ass gets sucked into a pool drain, the world just became less dangerous for my elderly parents and their 27 cats. And it doesn't have to be Dick Cheney. It could be Henry Kissinger, or just about any prosecutor in the country, or almost any lawmaker anywhere, or the guy who produced Michael Bolton's music. There are a lot of bad folks out there who deserve baths with toasters, or fluke batting cage accidents, or stray bullets from duck hunters. There's nothing wrong with us hoping all of those terrible things gravitate to the terrible people, and then celebrate when they do. In fact, if hopes and prayers have any power to make things manifest in our world, it could be that our magnanimity in giving bad people free passes has, over the course of human history, actually contributed to more bad stuff happening to good people. If we had only wished that bad stuff onto the people who deserved it, and then cheered when the universe delivered, perhaps it would happen with increasing frequency and intensity. I propose an experiment to test my theory, a very specific experiment. We need volunteers to form the Dick Cheney Rectal Cancer Hope Squad. They'll spend hours a day hoping for a specific bad event to happen to a specific bad guy. Then, if we find out on the news that Dick Cheney has malignant polyps in his anus, I can tell you I told you so. Come on, rectal cancer. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're hoping for cancer cells to metastasize in Dick Cheney's butt, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, 1349 Correctional Center Road, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org.
Would you all mind identifying yourselves to the audience?
Hello, I'm Inman.
And all.
And we're here to talk about armed community self-defense and experiences post-Charlottesville. I guess on that front, would either of you care to start by talking about your experiences of training with weapons?
How do you start?
Yeah, so I actually spent 10 years as an imperialist in the U.S. Army, deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan between the years of like 2009 through 2012. But, with leaving that and kind of developing an analysis around imperialism and its role in white supremacy, got involved with community defense basically around August 11th, 2017, so the night before Charlottesville, where I met a bunch of the folks that I do stuff with now. And since that time, we basically have been in some sort of training formation, focusing on small unit tactics in teams of basically 4 to 8, which would be a squad size element, a team of 4, but not anything really above that. So.
I did not serve in the United States military, which I'm very happy about. I've been around firearms in one way or another since probably I was about 15 or 16. I got involved in community defense and using firearms or training to use firearms in that capacity a couple months after the inception of the Redneck Revolt Network, and was a part of that for a good period of time. And since beginning to do that, I've been trying to scale up my skills and devote as much of my time, energy, whatever resources I have to making myself more competent at both executing that skill set, but communicating that skill set to others, particularly folks with more marginalized and threatened identities than mine. And sort of in the same way that I met on the night of August 11th, we've kind of both been on this journey together, taking what we experienced that weekend and trying to respond to, I guess, the shortcomings of that deployment of community defense and just be better and more apt at tasks we're asked to undertake.
Yeah, I think one thing that we've done consistently since Charlottesville is just have a discussion and just have a continuous discussion around what community defense means, and is it just showing up with guns? Is it unarmed security, unarmed self-defense, and what does that look like holistically? Because a strong community is one that has food security, water security, and so how do we incorporate these other aspects of community and strengthening community in a way that arms and armed defense is not the center focal point of our organizing effort and what we bring to the table. So I think another thing that is pretty influential in our discussion is just understanding the history of community defense and what that looks like, and as white cis dudes, how it is that we're breaking that mold of gun culture and capitalist culture around guns, and working to what Inman had said was just empower folks specifically from marginalized identities to have both a very practical knowledge of firearms safety, and then a cadre of folks that can train each other and kind of decentralized, because even on the left with gun ownership and security, it is heavily hetero, cis male, and patriarchal, and so just trying to disperse this knowledge and not hold on to it in any type of specialized manner. It's really important to the work that we do. Yeah,
something we've kind of both become increasingly critical of is what at least I feel is a very performative aspect of a lot of the larger so-called leftist firearms formations, which I don't necessarily think we need to start naming just yet, but I think there's a big difference between sort of a range club and a group that can actually be leveraged to hold space in an environment that the state is not offering protection outside of a rally, that sort of thing. Which isn't to say that those kind of organizations don't have their place, but neither of us are particularly interested in creating a gun culture on the left. We're interested in creating a culture of security and defense. So for us, what that looks like is becoming more flexible as a crew and being able to respond to really any kind of ask, whether that's providing mutual aid in the wake of a natural disaster or armed security, unarmed security, whatever that may be, but also, as we've kind of alluded to, along the way, taking our skill sets and our knowledge and giving them to other crews so that we're relying less on this vanguardist idea of a few armed formations. The one that always gets called on, ideally we'd like to see every crew or group or organization or group of friends fighting for collective liberation is able to leverage these tools and skill sets if they want to, rather than having to call the same group of white cis dudes over and over again from the same 2 or 3 organizations.
This is the Final Straw on Unbursts. You're listening to 2 anarchists in Appalachia speaking about armed community self-defense.
To respond to that, so it seems like Redneck Revolt, which folks have identified, or at least you've identified being involved with at one point, Inman, has a specific claim to building a leftist culture around guns and armed self-defense, engaging with existing culture and bringing that culture into left organizations or whatever. That's my read, at least. How does that differentiate from the model of going to community organizations to spread skill sets and safer use of those tools?
Well, the latter, I actually think, I said I wasn't going to start name-dropping organizations, but yeah, I guess it's got to happen at some point. I actually think Redneck Revolt has done that particular thing decently. I think it's groups like the Socialist Rifle Association that I'm concerned when I see language around providing an alternative to the National Rifle Association, or creating this, I guess, dual power of culture, which as an anarchist, I'm not really interested in that culture. I'm not interested in a world where firearms are that commonplace or even necessary. That's not the world I'm fighting for. So instead of trying to get people really excited about firearms, getting to the point where they're taking photographs of their new firearms next to their theory books and getting really excited about the gear, while obviously that's a really important part, we're more interested in folks getting the training and the skill sets to actually be able to defend themselves and the people that they care about and have affinity with. And that's a really different thing than going to a range day once every 2 weeks. Again, that's got its place, and I'm not knocking that, but saying that that's community defense is, in my view, completely incorrect. So I guess to kind of go back to your question, because I'm not sure that I totally answered it, the difference is we don't want to convince people to become a part of a gun culture. We don't want to convince people that there's like a safer, more liberatory-oriented version of getting really excited about AR-15s. We want people to be able to use them to defend themselves and be competent in that. And beyond that, don't need to participate in the culture.
Yeah, I think when we look at definitely when we talk about Charlottesville the first year and what that meant to be on a fire line in a fire team and that melee, was that even with the experience that we had range-wise, we did not have the experience to really be standing there with weapons in a crowd like that. It was a real recipe for disaster that didn't happen. The Klansmen that fired the shot did it at Emancipation Park instead of Justice Park, was where we were at. And I think it was important that day to hold that space specifically for anti-fascists, and we did that relatively successfully. Fashion never entered that park, even though they were around it multiple times that day. But yeah, just realizing that an embracement of this capitalist culture around guns and a reforming of gun culture is not liberatory. It's that abolition of this capitalist gun, toxic masculine culture that is really important to the work that we do. I think doing it autonomously, doing it by word of mouth instead of an above ground, this is our formation, do that, has been really beneficial, to the point to where the crew that we work in is predominantly LGBT and has been at most major actions on the East Coast in some form, both armed and unarmed, with very specific requests and very specific formations that are informed continuously by our praxis that has occurred in the past. So where I think some of these above ground formations and just a lot of things on the left is really theory based. We definitely are learning just through praxis, and then that theory is kind of following along. And like I said, again, historically there are a lot of really good examples of what community defense looks like in a holistic need. The Black Panthers, the Zapatistas, the Kurdish struggle in Rojava are all really good examples of how guns are a tool, but not the primary mode of social change.
Yeah, to back up, because I would suppose you probably had some like questions about, Charlottesville in particular, and maybe what informed these decisions. I guess what made me really interested in having this conversation is that since Charlottesville, I've seen a lot of what this sort of coalition of Redneck Revolt and Socialist Rifle Association people did around Justice Park on August 12th. I've seen the memory of that engaged with very non-critically. You actually interviewed Scott Crow at one point for his release of Setting Sights, and maybe a couple months after 12 in 2017, if I remember correctly, and you recounted a very fanciful tale of something that happened around Justice Park about us confronting League of the South and all this kind of stuff. And I remember laughing when I heard it and thinking, wow, holy crap, history moves really quickly, that we're not even half a year distant, and this is already being blown out of proportion and not engaged with critically. And I think that's a mistake, because there are so many times, and we can get into the specifics of this, but there's so many times on August 12th where I remember hearing something come over the radio or dealing with something face-to-face and thinking, I have no idea of what the recourse for this is. I remember hearing, shots fired at Emancipation. That was Richard Preston. And I look back at that tape and I have no idea how we would have responded in the formation we were in. And seeing those kind of tactical holes, because, we separated from that network, we meaning the two of us, not everyone who was there that day separated from that network, although many aren't part of the Socialist Rifle Association or Redneck Revolt. We really haven't had a really good way to put out sort of what we learned that day and how that's kind of intentioned our praxis and our training moving forward, to the point that we feel, at least I feel, and I feel okay speaking for you with this, watch sort of the model of the open carry thing that we did around Justice Park on August 12th repeated over and over again, whether it's moving around a march like at the Rockstone Mountain or at various other static actions. Watch the same thing be repeated over and over again. And I grow increasingly concerned because none of those days, thank goodness, have ended as like August 12th did. But a lot of the theories around open carry as a tactic haven't been tested in the ways that they were tested on August 12th, 2017.
Yeah, that's interesting. To hear you harken back to that conversation with Scott Crow, I should re-listen to that. I had a lot in my head at the time. But it's interesting because it's a point in recent history that it feels like a milestone, and the images that came out that were seen by the rest of the world seem to really ignite a lot of discussion and a lot of imagination around what's going on, like, what is this Antifa thing? Or, oh my God, these racists have rifles. All of these images sent around the world. I talked to people mostly in Europe and so-called Latin America who suddenly realized the insanity that goes on in the United States to some degree, exemplified by what went on that day. Can we talk about some of the practical dangers of engaging in that way the leftist armed formations did on A12? Also, can someone define the term range crew?
Yeah, so like a range crew is just like the group of people that you go to the range to practice with. I have a lot of problems with ranges. One, they're not really accessible to people from marginalized identities, and then also that like mentality that I can train for a three-dimensional battle space in this like very linear formation directly in front of me, little movement, if any movement, focused specifically on marksmanship versus like practical application of a weapon in an environment like that, are all things that like could easily breed like a false sense of security. Like even in the military, like we'd go to the range like every quarter of the year and just shoot there. But if we're not doing shoot houses and maneuvers, yeah, absolutely. How is it that we communicate? How is it that we set up a firing line that allows us to provide overwatch to another group moving and stuff like that? Like, if we're not having those discussions, then we're not really having any type of practical application of actual like tactics. It's just more of like, I hit the target. Look at, like Instagram posts or something like that. So I think that is important to realize. And then specifically around the threats of like what occurred in Charlottesville, one, state surveillance, state violence in an environment like that. Even if you were to be in proximity to an active shooter, like, your possession of weapons make you a target to the state just as much as anyone else. So you may or may not be able to neutralize that threat, but at the same time, in a crowded environment, like, you have to think about the trajectory and ballistics of the round. Is it going to go through somebody? Like, what's behind there? But also, like, what am I exposing myself to their state? And then I think surveillance-wise, we've seen some of our comrades, like, end up on surveillance watch lists because of that action. Organizationally, we were included within the lawsuit against white supremacists by businesses within the city of Charlottesville, which basically, even though I don't think it would happen, like, stopped the ability to recruit in that area based on this lawsuit. It's not a bad idea to make yourself a target to the fascists if you're willing to do that. I think as anti-fascists, we're all willing to, like, engage in that level of risk in one way or another, but one, not deeming yourself. But I really think it's, a three-way fight perspective is just that's the state is going to know who you are. And if you're above ground organization with a membership list and everything else, you open yourself up to infiltration and all types of, terrible stuff. So.
Yeah, so speaking very specifically to some of the instances on August 12th around Justice Park that made me pause and have in the year and a half or odd afterwards, I'll maybe cover some of those. And I guess I want to precede this by saying that, we were in Charlottesville doing what we did because we were explicitly asked by members of the community that we still share a lot of bonds of affinity with, and nothing I'm saying is a critique of the tactics that they proposed. I'm glad they proposed them. I think they were effective on the day. My observations are about ways we could have comported ourselves differently, and also how things could have gone wrong, and why that should maybe call for a reevaluation of that tactic. So I won't go into the organization of that group of people that was there that day for really clear reasons, but what I will say is we had 4 groups of people arrayed around the park, and we had, and this has been documented, I had multiple interfaces with groups of white nationalists and fascists, neo-Confederates, what have you. Most were crossing through us, trying to get to Emancipation Park, but there were a few groups that notably attempted to come into Justice Park and upset sort of the staging area and food not bombs and medic relief, all the kind of stuff that was happening there. So, speaking for myself, for my armament, I had an AR-15 style rifle with 6 magazines. Each of those magazines was loaded with 29 rounds of 5.56 green tips, and for whatever that's worth, that's an armor-piercing round. The majority of the people that were around that park were armed similarly. There were a couple handguns and there's a shotgun situated in there, but looking back on the choice of armaments and what people carried, most of it, of course, was informed by what we owned, what we possessed, and this was, when folks had just started buying gear and having the kind of resources available to do that, so there's some limitation there, but there wasn't really much critical consideration about the ballistics that we were carrying or what it would look like if we had to act with those weapons in self-defense, because, in our minds, even if we were going out there in a very non-performative manner to hold a space, I don't necessarily know, I can speak for myself, I hadn't actually conceptualized what happens if I have to discharge this weapon in self-defense in this space, which is just a lack of critical analysis on our part. We had done a great deal of event preparation. We had done a great deal of research on the site. We knew just about everything we possibly could about the space of ground we were going to be on. We did our homework in that regard, but there were a couple instances that really frightened me. In classes that I've kind of taught folks about basic firearms, the question about why I always have my sling on and why I always harp on buying a sling before all these other things comes up all the time. And, I go back to August 12th, a group of, I believe it was a couple of National Socialist Movement people came by Justice Park, and two of them came up to me when I was on my corner, and one of them tried to take my rifle away from me, and we kind of had a brief, I guess you'd call it a tussle. So that's why I always say, I've never had to use my firearm to defend myself, but I have had someone try to take it away from me. And, I thought about at that range where I'm, within breathing distance of these people, and they're trying to, take my rifle away from me, whether or not they're joking or whatever, they're putting their hands on my rifle. And, I was able to get them off. I thought about, what does that mean for, my rules of engagement? What is that? If someone's trying to take my firearm off of me, legally, what does that mean I have the right to do? If I hit this person with, my hands or whatever, what am I opening myself up to legally? And I didn't really have any good answers other than just taking my carabiner and clipping the stock of my rifle to my vest, which still doesn't seem like a great answer to that question. And there was another instance, particularly when towards the end of the day, when groups started filing out of the park, I was standing on one of the blocks of Justice Park in front of a bunch of the cannons that are in that park, and we watched a bunch of traditionalist worker party folks cross one of the side streets adjacent to us, and they sort of turned and they started forming their shield wall thing and doing that whole bit and looking towards us. I remember going in over the radio, hey, it looks like TWP is trying to roll on the park, because that's exactly what it looked like. And this is kind of the story that gets, repeated or whatever, is us, or one of the stories that got repeated is us facing down fascists or whatever. And a couple of us sort of stood with our rifles, and a bunch of folks gathered behind us and were chanting, and they eventually peeled off. But before that happened, one of the security contractors that was hired by the park pulled up in his truck next to me and came out and saw what was happening and saw what we were looking at, and he put on his body armor and pulled an IWI Tavor out of the back of his car, which is the weapon, one of the main weapons used by the IDF, horribly, and put a round in the chamber and looked at me and said, "Where do you want me to go?" And I remember just kind of thinking to myself, oh, what the what, I'm...
Oh, see that cop over there?
Yeah, and I looked over, and there's police officers watching this whole thing unfold, realizing that we completely have control of this space, and this person who is ostensibly a trained professional, whatever that means, he gets paid to stand at an entrance to a place where someone feels threatened with a rifle, is looking to us and asking us what to do. And I have no answer for him. I have no clue and say, here's how to drop into our group right now, or here's where to stand, or here's how to help, or here's our protocol. We have none of that. Furthermore, I'm looking down the street at this line of traditionalist worker party people, and I'm considering that, if one of them pulls a gun and we have to defend ourselves and shoot back, well, behind them is, okay, well, I see a mother with a stroller, there's a kid in the stroller, behind them is a row of houses, and there's a pie shop over there, and I think those two instances very specifically just made me feel like we have no frame of reference for what's occurring right now. If things actually do go sideways in that kind of a space, we're going to make the situation so much worse in an effort to defend this space.
The idealized version of, the barricades in Barcelona and you're just piled behind there is a very dynamic environment. And our intelligence preparation for that day was a good 30 days worth of looking at maps and looking at previous deployments of TWP and all of the groups that were going to go out there. What would you expect from the police in that instance? And so we did have fallback locations. We did talk somewhat about what if an unarmed formation tries to come at us, and what do we do in that instance? And what I think was pretty awesome about that was in these moments where it looks like unarmed formations were going to come, we were able to communicate to the other anti-fascist crews that were in the park at the time, and so we would have, you know, unarmed anti-fascists also like stand the line with us to confront that. And so like that type of there's a word for it, force multipliers perhaps, is like now we have the ability to take both of these things. And that was like, luckily the people in the park at the time like are people that we knew. I think one of the biggest things that come from Charlottesville is the depth of our relationship with each other and our affinity with each other from that moment, like has spurred just a lot deeper commitment to each other, a lot deeper conversation around what it looks like to support each other in those moments, and like from that, like adapting our tactics, but then also just having the trust of the people around us in a like a much deeper way has been really beneficial.
And I think, you know, that trust and, you know, building that up over the past, you know, year and a half, because, you know, there were a lot of ways that we, you know, let a lot of people down that weekend too. And so recognizing how we can act differently in those spaces tactically, be more available to what folks actually need and what we think they need. Having those like critical conversations around like, does it actually make sense to put on our plate carriers and grab the long guns and go into this public square if we're just being asked to hold a space or help out a medic team or whatever the ask may be, or does it make more sense to be a little bit more quiet, have, you know, sidearms or be concealed carrying and have our medic stuff and be in a position in a place where no one hopefully even knows we're there, operating in that capacity, and being able to be tactically viable but also responsible with, you know, our choices of equipment, our choices of ballistics, all those things, and like take it seriously. I think like, our ability to do that rather than trying to like superimpose our desires of how we want to act as a group on an action space, I think is good.
This is the final straw on Bursts. You're listening to two anarchists in Appalachia speaking about armed community self-defense.
Yeah, and our like commitment to unarmed self-defense has like definitely increased from that. A lot of us engage in some sort of like hand-to-hand fighting training, and if we do engage in that, like we bring that back to our crew. We make sure that basic skills are being passed along. And there's a number of fighting styles that people can choose from, but I tend to think that like the martial arts that are really focused on form or artistic expression, things like Taekwondo and stuff, don't really have practical application. But like myself, I do Krav Maga training at a non-Zionist focused gym. There's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is developed as like kind of a definite self-defense fighting style out of Brazil that is like really good. And just like how is it that we can defend space without actually engaging in even armed defense of that space, and that has like been really beneficial to it. And then also I think like our commitment to coupling armed and unarmed self-defense with medical training, specifically around trauma and acute trauma medicine, how to deal with sucking chest wounds and how to stop extensive bleeding or to apply a tourniquet, are all like really basic things that coincide with our use of armed defense to the point to where when we train and practice, like a lot of times we incorporate all of these things into one type of like training weekend where we're engaging in all those things at once, which has been, I think, really beneficial and something that's just like deepens our praxis and our ability to respond, like Inman was saying, to the needs of the community versus coming in and creating some sort of hierarchy because we have guns, which is not what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think because we've, for whatever reason, been in a lot of these things on the East Coast over the past 2 years, I think we've been privileged enough to really have what we can actually do and actually offer be really picked apart. You know, I think if people are going to be showing up in a public arena with firearms, whether they're covert or overt, and they don't know how to defend themselves without using those guns, it's ridiculous. And the amount of people I know that actively show up in spaces with arms that don't do any kind of martial arts training or can't go hands off, which is realistically what's actually needed 99.9% of the time, absurd. The number of folks that will go out into the public square and have carrying guns without any medical gear or training is, I don't actually have space for calling that anything other than irresponsible. Like, if you're going to carry a gun in day-to-day life or in an action, and you don't also have a tourniquet, you can't apply that tourniquet in, less than 30 seconds, you don't need to be carrying that gun. Full stop. And it's not a case of being elitist, it's a case that if, folks are going to call themselves a certain thing and you're not able to deliver in both the most chill, safe scenarios or the most dangerous, messed up scenarios, then you're creating a really dangerous false expectation of what you can deliver, and that's going to hurt a lot of people, yourself included.
What does the brain do you think, in a scenario where you feel a threat coming and the thing that you jump to is a firearm as your way to defend yourself? Like, do you think that you'll have a tendency, if you can't defend yourself without firearms, to just automatically assume that the appropriate way of dealing with whatever threat is coming to you is with that? Or am I just sort of exemplifying an anti-gun perspective by asking that?
I think when you look at like the police and the way that in which the police handle threats, specifically with firearms, we see the end result of that is murdered black and brown people all over the place. I think if that is the only tool in your toolkit, then you need to deepen your toolkit, because that is not the answer. In this space, in this country, as a leftist, like that immediate grasp to a firearm in the face of danger and fear is a crutch, I think. And it's our ability to like confront this fear and to move through that. I think that kind of defines us differently. We're not replicating the state in that sense. We're willing to put our lives on the line, but we're also willing to do that in a way that reinforces the safety of the community that we're in and everything. And so if your first reaction is to just draw a firearm, then I can't say that you're probably operating on a level that's necessarily safe for the community that you're in, especially unarmed threat, right? Like, that's not what we want to be doing for legal reasons and for like what we're trying to create.
Yeah, this entire journey for me has been one of a lot of self-discovery and picking apart where I'm really strong, where I'm really weak, and I'm really grateful to one of our friends and comrades in the crew that she's been doing Krav Maga for quite some time, and is really, really dope when it comes to like communicating those skills on the basic level and just like fighting in general. And she was really critical. She's like, yeah, you're like really solid with this firearms and this like maneuvering stuff, but like I'm not quoting her exactly, but like where's your toolkit at with like unarmed stuff? And yeah, she was right, and I got to like pick that apart and see like where am I like an incomplete person if I'm trying to like project to my community, whatever that means, to the people I'm showing up to help keep safe, that this massive foundational thing, how to use my hands to defend myself and other people, what does that say about my ability to use a firearm and discern when it makes sense to go to that level of escalation? And not everyone is like, I think, is privileged to like have people in your crew like hold you like that, who say like, hey, you're kind of really weak in this regard and you need to step up. I think like every crew could like use more of that for sure. But yeah, and sometimes you like learn the hard way. Like, I was kind of going to martial arts training like once every 2 weeks maybe if I had the time for it and was feeling really good. And then I got my beat. Couldn't show up for my friends because I couldn't take a couple hits to the head. And that was like a huge reality check. So I started going to the gym, and making sure I was taking as many martial arts classes as I could, the next day. And I guess that story is just to, show finding those deficiencies in yourself. And carrying a gun like every single day on your hip or like at the front of your waistband or whatever is like a really kind of like seductive thing, because it makes your life really exciting. And you need to be aware of like what that does to you. When you like put that gun in your holster, in your concealed holster or whatever, in your locked glove box of your car, and your tourniquet in your back pocket and all that kind of stuff, you've immediately like taken your really like mundane day that, even if you're an anarchist, you're still probably working some kind of a job or hanging out with your friends, But all of a sudden, you've now transformed yourself into someone with the potential to respond to a situation with deadly force. You've transformed yourself into like the potential hero in the situation. It makes your day more exciting because all of a sudden you're now hyper-vigilant, hyper-aware of your situations, your surroundings, and prepared to respond at a moment's notice. And, I'm not advocating against not carrying, obviously, but I think being aware of, like, where your brain's at, if you don't actually have a frame of reference for unarmed fighting or verbal de-escalation, for example, like, all the things that happen before, you clear your garment and draw your firearm. If you don't actually know those things, then, you're no better than every dude with a Punisher skull walking down Main Street, hoping to be the Wayne LaPierre's good guy with a gun. So
I think the threat, the New Zealand shooter kind of like really in this moment like reframed some stuff for me, and just this like idea that violence, can always occur at any moment and can be carried out, and just that we don't have, like, there's no way in which the state or formations like ours can truly prepare for all of the types of scenarios of violence that can come at a moment's notice kind of thing. And so just ensuring that that we have a depth of skills to work from instead of just one thing, and like what that really means, and how it is that we are not like recreating the state, or not like these 3%er are groups.
Don't worry, I can edit that.
But like they, like even the mentality of the way that we deploy to these events is different from them. So a lot of like my experience just monitoring them and infiltrating them, whatever, is just that they operate from a framework that is very much hierarchical, like very much try to replicate what the army or what the military does. They don't think, the most effective fighting force is a two-person team, like that you can't get any smaller than that and be effective. And so we build out from there versus like trying to recreate a battalion, like 180 folks or so. Our tactics like don't match up to that, and I think that is like really good and differentiates ourselves like further from those types of things, is that like we have an understanding of what we're capable of as in an affinity group model that is in line with like our values as anarchists, and the way that we're trying to recreate ourselves, like not recreate ourselves, but like the way that we're trying to form ourselves, and then also like the security culture that we practice and how it is much better at it, in that smaller, tighter formation.
And that's key. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. Here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Good morning, slaves. Looking for relief from the steaming hot plate of bullshit served up on the daily by the mainstream media? Are you thirsting for solid and reliable information to escape the mind-numbing vortex of corporate news and Trump tweets? Are you ready to check out every time you hear Despacito on the radio one more fucking time? Then tune your dial to Sub.media, a mouth-watering hub of infotainment and subversion that'll make you want to quit your job and join the motherfucking resistance. Dive into our newly designed website and gorge yourself on one of the 500 plus videos and audio tracks from our vast library of anarchist films, hip-hop, and riot porn, or choose from one of our original shows like Trouble, Burning Cop Car, A's for Anarchy, Video Ninja Reports, and The Stimulator. Fuck Netflix. Watch Sub.media.
Just drawing back to Charlottesville 2017, I'm curious what you all think about how social dynamics were affected outside of the armed groups on the left by the presence of visibly armed groups on the left. Like, we're not necessarily responsible for how other groups react to us, but I'm sure that some people were very excited about seeing it, especially when seeing it as a counter to the armed white nationalists that were around, and other people who had probably already been traumatized by people with guns throughout their lives were nervous about mostly white people, mostly cis dudes, with guns around them. How, in your experience and assessment afterwards, did other people in the crowd who were not white nationalists get affected by it? And how did white nationalists get affected that were in armed groups, or threepers, or what have you, or law enforcement? How did that change the dynamics?
So I think how it feels to have a bunch of mostly cis white guys show up into the public square with firearms, because that doesn't characterize what our crew is now. But to have that happen is jarring and hella triggering for a lot of folks. I don't think that's something I recognized at the time. I was like going into it with a pretty macho attitude of like, this is needed on the day, this was asked for, without thinking about how that could affect folks really, really deeply. And I think that's one of the nice things about having a crew that draws from, I guess, like a longer organizing experience. People like know our faces, or most of our faces at this point. People are in crew that have like been around, so there's a higher degree of accountability than being an outsider cadre organization of newer radicals, which is what the majority of Redneck Revolt, Socialist Rifle Association are. Showing up into a space and claiming legitimacy because they're asked to by 2 or 3 people and have the guns. It's not a good model for accountability, because at the end of the day, if this people mess up, half the time people don't know who to talk to. I had that. I feel like I need to be held accountable for something once. Well, have many times, and I'm sure will again. But to do with that weekend, and people didn't even know who to talk to. How could you? Because half the people I was purporting to defend and protect, I had no bonds of affinity or trust with. So I think that's really tricky. Some folks were excited. I remember hearing some people like actually cheer when we rolled up to Justice Park. But some folks that I knew actually from my community, like, visibly disturbed, weren't super happy about it. As far as the Reapers, they could have really cared less about our presence. The white nationalists that were there that weekend, we have documented examples on podcasts or whatever of groups and crews specifically avoiding Justice Park to get to the rally. So, I mean, in that regard, it was successful. I'm not sure if that success was worth making people's weekend that much more traumatizing. I remember, with folks that were sort of not, militant anti-fascists or white nationalists, just, residents of Charlottesville, I kept interfacing with folks from the community who were very upset at seeing a bunch of, black-clad, people wander around this park with AR-15s. I remember an interaction with one person where he was dressing me down and yelling at me and was really upset, and I just sort of tried to keep a blank face, and I said, hey, I get you're having these feelings, I can't talk right now, I've got a task to do. And after the car attack, he approached me and apologized and said, I get why y'all are here, and that's not a good thing, because it took a really horrific incident and a tragedy for him to recognize we were needed in that space, and that doesn't feel like a great trade-off.
One story that like really sticks out for me from that, and is like this evolution of thought around armed security, is from a local Charlottesville person that we both know pretty well. Before August 12th, considered himself a pacifist, and following August 12th, has taken up arms and has sought training and advice and mentorship from us specifically around what that means. And I think it's just like really important when we frame gun control and gun regulation in this like neoliberal sense, is that what neoliberals do best is outsource things they don't want to do, and one of those is, I think, is violence. And so the discussion around the role that armed defense plays within the left is one of like, either folks get it seems like, and some like how deep that is, who knows, but and then this idea that we can just outsource our protection to the state, and that's like the last thing that we want to do. And so I do think like having honest discussions around armed security, what community defense looks like, interfacing with people that aren't comfortable with it but recognize it as a need, and even those that don't recognize it as a need but like for some reason we're in that space, how is it that we can shift that mentality away from one of no guns but the police and the military can have all the guns, to one to where like an actual a culture within the left of defense, how that protects us and does not replicate the state. And I think that there has been this movement back and forth ever since. And so you get these terrible tragedies of white nationalist lone shooters that commit horrendous crimes and people call out for gun control, but then fail to recognize that the gun laws that do exist are disproportionately applied to black and brown folks, used to criminalize that, and then also just the power that puts in an already extremely powerful and omnipresent police state specifically. So I'm sure that the rise of armed leftism has created some headaches for police, intelligence fusion centers, and everything else, and this need to track that kind of stuff. But when we look at where violence comes from, it is continuously from the right, continuously from white nationalists that are armed and are going to act regardless of whatever formation that they participate in, because they act alone a lot of times. And I think that in this moment, approaching 2020, the beginning of the spring fighting season this year, we saw the New Zealand shooter, that shooting occur, and then attacks actually replicated themselves in England and across the world, to the point to where churches have been, just this past weekend, 3 churches have been firebombed in Louisiana in a single parish. Possible white nationalist attack at the Highlander Center, and just this escalation of tactics and this escalation of violence. We have to be doing this, and we have to be having these discussions, and we have to be thinking deeper about community defense in a way that is really building power within our movement, and not looking to the state for any type of support in that essence, which I think gun control, gun regulation is that push to let the state figure it out, and that's nothing we want to be a part of.
This is the Final Straw on Bursts. You're listening to 2 anarchists in Appalachia speaking about armed community self-defense.
So there was, I think, you had mentioned the organizing methodology of right-wing armed groups, militia or whatever, is to replicate the way that the military operates, using manuals and reproducing that. And an alternative method might be for where the needs are for community armed self-defense, fill the holes, and do a sort of call and response with the community about what the needs are, disperse the training, so on. So I think that the way that the left imaginary frequently views self-defense or armed interfacing with the state and power is not that dissimilar with how elements of the insurgent right militia movement do, in terms of viewing people's right fighting forces as the creation of a people's army to go up against the government forces that would create a revolutionary backbone. How does the framework that you're talking about with armed community self-defense correlate or not with the idea of revolutionary formations? Is that a separate conversation than what we're having right now, or within the same vision of what we're talking about?
I mean, personally, I dream of an autonomous Appalachia. This is my home, and autonomy comes from the ability to provide in all different aspects. Just give me some clean water I can drink out of my well, But I think where in the formations that we tend to exist in is one, hierarchy is not necessarily recreated in the same manner, and a lot of our decision making is dispersed. We don't have a leader by any means, and we don't view ourselves as a vanguard, which I think a revolutionary armed wing faction says it or not, that's probably how they view themselves, as this idea, our idea is to just disperse skill sets so folks can act in any moment. And so is that in a revolutionary period with the state, or is that just the absence of the state due to natural disaster or something like that? And I don't think that, I think that that's where our big differentiation comes from, is that we don't have that hierarchy. We don't have that type of I'm the leader and everyone's going to listen to me. It is really what is an ecological approach to where we are reinforcing a community, building a community, being reinforced by that community, and their acceptance of our presence and everything like that. And that is different, but I think that specifically builds revolutionary power and revolutionary momentum, because we're focused on the autonomy of both the individual, but then also the community, in a way that an occupying force, be it the state or a 3%er militia or something, it's just they're not going to do. They're there to occupy territory. They're there to control something, and we are simply a part of something and of a much larger whole that is is like, I think the biggest difference for me, or like how I view that. The skill sets that we develop, train with, acquire have applications both on a revolutionary battlefield or as much as they do on just within our, in my hall or whatever. Like, it's the same concept. So
yeah, we're certainly not naive enough to imagine our formation blossoming and growing into a revolutionary people's army. I mean, I'm an insurrectionary anarchist. That's not how I conceptualize things occurring in any case. What I am interested in is formation's abilities to hold space for moments of insurrection or revolution or whatever you want to call it to exist, or to make communities more stable when they are destabilized and the state vacates. Think of natural disaster and how much inspiration I personally take from the work done around Hurricane Katrina and that sort of thing. That was the first time I heard about armed anarchists doing this sort of thing. As a good friend said to me a couple months ago when we were talking about this stuff, is more guns don't make more of a revolution, and I completely agree with that, especially here in the so-called United States. We've just got to be able to kind of create that space or step into spaces created by reaction or the state. A lot of leftists, I think, tend to draw inspiration from the Spanish Civil War and imagine it as being this kind of anarchist or communist revolution, when in reality it was just a group of armed defense formations stepping in to protect their communities in light of a fascist coup, and relatively small formation. Most of my friends have heard me say this quip a million times, but the CN Defense Committee of Barcelona in 1936 had 23 members. So I think that shows how our small formations could really help to preserve a revolutionary moment, or help keep people safe in the event of things really getting bad. That being said, piggybacking up with what said, a lot of our training does look really similar to things that the state would do or the militias would do. It's important that we learn the tactics and strategies of people that in those situations would not be our friends, to say the least. So that means kind of scaling your tactical ability and recognizing how that is relevant in the here and now. It seems really ridiculous to practice high-risk entry, how to go into a building and clear it. But the real-world application that has is if your friend calls you and they think that their abusive ex might be in their house, and they know you have a gun and some kind of training, and you go over there with a flashlight and your pistol with a weapon light and a tourniquet in your back pocket. It's a pretty good skill to be able to go through that house successfully, safely, and efficiently, and actually verify that it's clear. So, or in the same way that training as a small fire team. While we can't replicate how the state trains exactly, of course, because of technology, and we don't have access to IR stuff and night vision and all that sort of thing. But those kind of methods can be really useful for how your affinity group might move through a really messed up protest space and encourage a group of cohesion and enable you to kind of get home a little bit more safely or accomplish whatever you want to accomplish a little bit more efficiently, if that makes sense.
This is the final straw on Bursts. You're listening to two anarchists in Appalachia speaking about armed community self-defense.
I was going to ask, what sorts of insights y'all have had doing this sort of work and a lot of thinking over the last year and a half about approaching community networking and reaching outside of activist groups to skill share and hear what groups in the community, demographics that we don't represent necessarily. Do you have the insights for people of how to start working on building relationships? This doesn't have to necessarily specifically be about community armed self-defense. This is just a topic I like to hear people talk about. How do you reach out to people that you don't look like and have different experiences and offer some of the same skills and offer some of the things that you offer? Do y'all have any insights in that?
Yeah, I think one of the most transformational kind of moments for me has been just really putting principles of mutual aid into practice, and what mutual aid means, and then how it is that we can show up in those spaces. So my experience from Hurricane Florence and working through the disaster relief process in communities that we had no real connection to, not necessarily representative of the places that I've lived and come from, but that ability to meet people where they're at and to work with them to meet basic needs, identify basic needs, and then meet them has been like a really good way to expose people to anarchism, to the theory of our practice in a way that is tangible to them, and then opens them up to like broader ideas, broader discussions, different types of skill shares. So to go into a community to say like, we're here to work with you, we're here to help just like meet these needs that you all have, then no matter what political stance someone has necessarily, if they're apolitical, disengaged, or even progressive or liberal, they seem to be much more willing to and open to the ideas. And I think that is like rooted just really deeply into like relationship building, and showing up when other folks won't show up. And it's that commitment to folks to put yourself in the middle of a hurricane or in a snowstorm or something like that. And we continuously show up in those moments when we are accountable to those communities, when none of those moments exist, then like there's just a much deeper understanding for each other. You start building that trust that's necessary with each other, so that when moments do arise where there's a need for something, you're not just an outside force coming in, but you have some sort of like relationship with somebody, and you have some sort of mutual understanding of what the needs are in both that moment and then in just normal life.
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, just not being able helps, which seems incredibly simplistic, but I think just being courteous to folks and being really humble and sweet and generous with your time and your language and how you hold space, I think goes a really long way, especially for the kind of stuff that we're specifically talking about, carrying arms and wielding this violence. People are expecting you to show up in space and be like confrontational or abrasive, and it does a lot to not be that. I think also, for doing the work in your own communities in whatever town or city or county or wherever you happen to live, it helps a lot to be engaged in the community in other ways that aren't this or aren't in, directly anarchist praxis. Whether that means going to church service, even if you're a hardcore atheist, if that's where your community is and that's where people who might be vulnerable are going to meet, that's where you should be. And putting yourself out there with more above ground projects and having above ground projects that are completely and totally separate from this kind of stuff, I think is really important, because then people have built up an expectation of how you handle yourself, your follow through, that kind of stuff, so that when there is a desire for, say, something like armed security, they kind of have some kind of a frame of reference of how you conduct yourself in those situations. Yeah, and I think, as kind of pointed to, sometimes being the only folks who go into a really weird, sketchy situation kind of shows people, I guess, your integrity. So not being afraid to go into places as long as you're not going to endanger yourself and make yourself a liability on the way to help other people. Yeah, showing up, meeting people where they're at, and which I think is a phrase that gets bandied about a lot. And I think that just means, to paraphrase Bonanno, to not try to convert everyone to anarchism, but to get other folks to do anarchist stuff with you, and have an expectation that everyone's going to share our politics, but in times of crisis they'll throw down with us or with you in all kinds of cool ways, and just accept that.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate that last point, it's just that I come from a rural space, so I don't expect everyone to be an anarchist, but if we're doing above ground organizing that has programs based on anarchist theory, the harm reduction, food security work, just basic mutual aid stuff. Like whatever that end goal is not necessarily maybe the anarchist utopia, but the actions that willingness to be in tension with the state in order to provide something better for your community is like a way to motivate people regardless of their political stance. Like I'm not going to work with Nazis, I'm not going to work with 3%ers or nationalists or anything like that, but the majority of people in our communities really don't fall into those categories. And I think looking at the history of community defense and where we draw from and stuff, the Black Panthers were a good example. Multiple different community programs. Armed praxis was not just the one thing that they did, and was that continuous ability to meet their community's needs through other programs that allowed them to also exist in this armed wing and have community support in that sense too. And I think that's really important, is that we're base building, that we're basically, building the sea in which we can swim in, and I think that's the really important part to that.
Yeah, and maybe one more point. I think sometimes, I guess what I'm not saying, and maybe you disagree with me, but I don't think you do. I'm not advocating for organizations or crews of people that do everything all the time. I think there is a need for crews to specialize in certain things. A lot of what we concentrate on is this scaled up or scaled down tactical community defense stuff, but that also means that we can tap in to other organizing efforts as time presents itself. I think sometimes when organizations want to do everything and be everything to everyone, and sometimes they end up being kind of a little bit bad at everything they do. So I think it's striking a balance, knowing what you can take on, but at the same time, if you're going to be as I keep saying, going into the public square with firearms, or to the private square even with firearms, you better have a reputation for doing other stuff right as well.
Yeah, regional autonomy is, I think, only achievable really through this idea that different groups of people can be good at different things, and then looking at people's own personal abilities and what they're capable of, physical limitations and everything like that. This is not something maybe open to everyone for any reason, but then there are other places in which people can fill in, and we can really kind of just transfer those resources of knowledge and skill set to community, can depend on community for one aspect of something or another, and we're building trust across lines and borders, and we're making sure that the abundance that we have in one place is shared with places that might not have that same abundance. So
This is the Final Straw on Bursts. You're listening to two anarchists in Appalachia speaking about armed community self-defense.
So I'm curious if y'all have any in terms of sharing with other groups and allowing for specialization where it makes sense, where people's passions or abilities drive them. Do you have any anecdotes that you care to share about what that can look like? If that's too vague or would be too leading of a question.
Just basically, are you kind of speaking to how you identify what someone's talents and passions are and plug them in appropriately? Is that?
Sure, that's a good question. I was more thinking, are there, I don't know, it was kind of an uninformed question. Well, okay, unless you want to answer that question, I'd take another approach. Are there any resources or starting points that y'all might suggest for people that are looking to form an affinity group or start working towards trying to engage community self-defense and community self-reliance and autonomy?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, not going to tell you any of them. So I think, because I think what we've both done a lot is kind of rag on some of the larger formations. One of the things they do is provide a framework of resources and ways to kind of tap into knowledge and that sort of thing, and that's really cool. I perhaps think it's at times the wrong knowledge to tap into, but anyway. So I think when you're talking about doing something like this, it's a little bit more intimidating. a couple places I would suggest starting is of course, going to the range and doing that kind of stuff with your friends is really important. But I think before that, I think if community self-defense is something you're really interested in adding to your toolkit, building up from unarmed self-defense, medical skills, and then starting to add in armed elements to that, you'll have better group cohesion if you start from kind of those more basic and more generally applicable learning blocks. Go ahead and get the right equipment. We can talk about that later. But once you're there, if you don't know an anarchist or a leftist or whatever ist you want to call them in your area that knows these kinds of skill sets well and can kind of help your group get up to speed, it's really a shame, but the best thing you can do is, if there's someone in your group that, holds a less marginalized identity, if you have someone or a couple people in your crew that are, white cis guys and they can go into a reactionary training space and get skills and get taught by ex-mil, ex-cops. It sucks, but if you're able to go into those spaces and not be immediately threatened just because of who you are and who how you present to the world, then that's definitely training you should get. As far as other resources, there's a lot of really great books out there. I think every affinity group that wants to build these kind of skill sets should be looking into an author by the pseudonym of John Mosby. He wrote 2 books called The Reluctant Partisan. If you're able to look past the kind of reactionary garbage in there, there's incredible information, particularly in the second book, about not just armed self-defense and really nitty-gritty stuff about high-risk entry and operating in and around vehicles, but also community mapping, intelligence gathering that can be really useful to what your AG does anyway. They're expensive books, but I think every AG should go online, Google The Reluctant Partisan by John Mosby, pool money, get that book, and hopefully don't give him too much money, but I've read his blog and I know something that keeps him up at night is anarchists and the black bloc getting guns. So sorry John Mosby if you're hearing this, it's happening, and your book's been very valuable, so I suggest everyone check that book out and use it for what it's worth.
Yeah, I think also that just the online resources that are available to folks, videos, YouTube and Instagram, you can self-teach yourself these skills and these tactics, and just diving into that is good. Like was said before, if you have the ability to go to some of these different defense workshops taught by reactionary then do that, because they are going to pass on skills and they are going to give you a tactical knowledge that you may not have. And then anecdotally, I think kind of to the idea of how does this work across regions and stuff, is we have worked with groups that are much more focused on medical training to provide training around what is called tactical combat casualty care, which is TC3 is the acronym for that, but it's just basically how do you care for people under fire, how do you deal with injury and stuff like that, and to take somebody who's very knowledgeable in medical stuff, allow them to run a scenario based on that while we're also working through tactical movement or something like that is super beneficial. And so then you have both an outside perspective, the skill share aspect that's going along with that, and just breaking down that knowledge a little bit and dispersing it out in ways that are fair. I think there's the possibility for specific events that affect people maybe that we don't necessarily work with or have not had a relationship with before, that can bring us together, and just being willing to put yourself into that situation and willing to kind of break with the purity stance and understand that in this moment specifically, moment in time, moment in history, our ability to work across groups and work across ideas and stuff like that, theory is necessary to give us the space just to be able to continue to operate the way that we're doing, if not like claim some territory or reframe some thought process around this stuff. But yeah, Max, I think, is it Max Velocity as well? Small Unit Tactics is another book that is easily purchasable on Amazon, and really good book. And then there is a reactionary right named Samuel Colbert, who focuses a lot on like community intelligence and has produced some books around what community intelligence looks like. He doesn't break it down beyond like, I think the battalion level, 180 foot or more than 200 people. Doesn't break it down to like an affinity group level, but there are concepts of open source intelligence and planning and stuff like that can also be integrated. And so, buy these books, photocopy them or scan them or something like that, and get them out there to everyone is good. And I also think that like what's really important and something that I've been thinking a lot about is just like, what does community defense look like in history? Like for my specific area, for Appalachia, Central Appalachia, there is a history of this, and like recognizing that we're not anything new, but we are simply a reverberation of that history, and that the praxis and work that we put in now is setting a tone for future folks to also do. So if we allow ourselves to be neutered by the state, if we pull back because of some sort of like ideological framework and that like hegemony that's been created by neoliberalism, then we're not necessarily preparing future generations to be defending themselves and to be doing this. And I think that's really important, is that like both this is a historical moment, but the location we're in is this type of work is historical, and if we want to have a future anywhere close to what I dream of, then we have to be doing the work that's like hard and difficult, but also like very necessary.
Yeah, I think a couple more, I guess, tips about the resources. One thing that was really huge for our collective that kind of was, we were able to take a lot of desire to learn and a lot of focus and energy, and all that sort of coalesced and exploded and blossomed, however you want to put it, when we were able to have access to land. And there's a lot of privilege inherent in that, but if you live in a rural area, if you live near a rural area, I would just reach out to your networks, reach out to your friends, your family, and just find out, who has 5, 10, whatever acres, what weird land is in someone's family and their cousin of a cousin, and will be okay with you taking some friends out and just tell them you're doing target practice. Making sure, obviously, you've got your safety protocols down, and there's plenty of really great resources for that we don't need to belabor here. But the ability to go and train in a 3-dimensional space where you're able to move and shoot, work on communicating with your partners and with your team, with your affinity group, is able to take you from that theoretical range stuff to actually replicating real world type situations and gaining a little bit more practical knowledge. And going beyond that, another cool tool that we like to use is something called force-on-force training, and that's something I don't think a lot of people on the left broadly or anarchists really talk about doing quite as much as I wish they would. Force-on-force essentially refers to when you're using simulated rounds and you essentially work out whatever kinks you may have in your tactics or your operational skills. So for the military and for law enforcement, that looks like simunition, ammunition, or really high-tech stuff. For us, that can look like going to your local sporting goods store and purchasing some cheap airsoft guns and eye protection. It feels really cheesy, and I would recommend having a good amount of tactical background before you do it, so it doesn't just evolve into game playing. But for instance, if you're working on pistol disarms, how to take a handgun away from someone, a really great way to find out if that method is BS or not is to actually be being, have someone try to draw down on you with something that can fire a projectile. You'll learn real fast. Or if you're trying to figure out if your way for entering a room works, same thing. Someone hitting you with a projectile, you'll figure out really quickly. So learning how to validate all of your theoretical stuff in your training against some kind of forceful validation has been really, really useful for us, and I'd recommend that folks kind of experiment with that and play around with that a little bit more. A lot of really top tier special forces units are training like that, and I think it's a pretty affordable way to take a page out of their playbook.
This is the Final Straw on Unbursts. You're listening to two anarchists in Appalachia speaking about armed community self-defense.
I can think of just a few examples in my head in the U.S. and abroad where communities may be engaging in training using airsoft or using paintball, coming under surveillance, and that being used to charge them as an armed group preparing for something, revolution or whatever. Or it's led to infiltration or attack by intelligence agencies because of the visibility of that. So I don't know if it's a thing to keep in mind or to be aware of when figuring out where you're going to be practicing or playing and who your neighbors are. I don't know if you have any insights into safer practices and setting up that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's where having that land or having access to somewhere where you can do this, it can look like some abandoned buildings, making sure that location is private, making sure you know who lives around it. You know, us in particular, when we were able to move into a space, the first thing they did was we went around to all of our neighbors and, you know, said, hey, we're going to be shooting every now and again or whatever. If it's ever too much, give us a call. And kind of getting a feel for who those neighbors are. Are they likely to call the cops? What's their disposition? And really, really checking your site out. But beyond that, really refraining from filming what you're doing, taking photographs of what you're doing. There's some things you film for learning like technique and being able to critique form on those types of reps when you're doing, you know, live fire training and that sort of thing. But for this kind of stuff, you know, just no phones, leave them far, far away. You know, even having people turn off any tracking, you know, easy GPS stuff on their phone and disabling that to the best of their ability. Ideally, leaving that kind of stuff as far away from where the training is happening as possible is ideal. Other than that, I mean, yeah, doing this kind of stuff in a public way, in an above ground way, is going to get you state attention, which is why doing it in a using decentralized affinity group models is the only way to do it without really messing yourself up. Alternately, you can kind of do this stuff in plain sight. You know, you can have your crew together, and if you want to do the 4x4 stuff, go to an airsoft field, and you can run through your, you know, what you do as a team, how you train, and, you know, do it in a more kind of neutral setting where you're not going to get clocked quite as easily.
Yeah, I think just like making sure security culture is more than just a word in actual practice, and then like was said, just that affinity group model protects us in so many different ways from infiltration that we should, you know, this is exactly how we should be doing this here too. So, and really that above ground type of formation stuff that requires you to promote what you're doing, to like document what you're doing, to have membership lists and everything like that. Those are all threats. And so if we're gonna have real conversations about community defense, then I think the autonomous model is like the best way to protect yourself.
I'd like to ask about if there are any of the other elements of community self-defense and self-reliance that are especially inspirational. I know that the response to disasters, like mutual aid disaster relief type stuff, has been brought up. The Black Panther Party has been brought up as an example. Their programs, their educational programs, their breakfast programs, that was also educational. The sickle cell anemia, the newspaper, and the outreach and politicization. A lot of the work that those groups did. And even though a lot of the education that comes out through the American system mostly focuses on the guns, like most people that I've talked to of a certain age have expressed, oh, they were racists. Like my parents thought that they were racists. Are there any examples of groups or models that do well the other parts of the food security, the harm reduction that y'all want to shout out, or that people might pay attention to or take a page from?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, the two that pop into my brain, three, I suppose. I really like the model of mutual aid disaster relief and what they've, again, I know we've talked about the disaster relief stuff, but, recognizing they have this broad umbrella that provides infrastructure and support and something to tap into, but at the same time has the ability to be autonomous and kind of allow itself to expand and contract with need. I think that's really amazing, and organizations like that are able to be, I think, more flexible because of that structure. As far as local organizations that, provide this, broad community defense or reliance work, being based in Western North Carolina currently, and being especially hard hit by the opioid crisis and that sort of thing, a lot of the harm reduction work occurring, the Steady Collective in Asheville comes to mind, and High Country Harm Reduction, is that right, that just started up? Yeah, so I mean that work's invaluable and is so specific to our area and is tapping into an obvious need.
Yeah, I think harm reduction specifically is like such a unique idea around just reducing harm in all aspects of that. So not just opioids, but safe sex. We can look at like the way it intersects with immigration and just what our community needs are, and recognizing that like these structural problems that we have are not necessarily solvable by one person or one group, but we can reduce that harm on a community, I think fits really nicely in with the concept of community defense, the armed or unarmed. And just another group that, I don't think it's cliche to say, but like just the Kurdish struggle, the women's revolution in Rojava, and the amount of underground work that went into preparing those communities for years and years before the Syrian revolution ever began, and like how important that was for the moment where armed defense was necessary to protect people, the way people could move into that. This really illustrates that if we're only operating in one line of praxis, or if we're not like building trust within our community, then when an opportunity arises, when a moment arises where the state collapses or is threatened, or any of that stuff vacates space or becomes extremely, just violent beyond its normal violence, how important it is to step into that. And I think that struggle, that ongoing struggle, even now, is a good example of like the ways that we can be building within communities, and the necessity to do that either above ground or like they did from a very underground perspective, but they still did the work, and I think that is like just really motivating.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, coming back to our communities in Western North Carolina and Appalachia, I mean, I can't begin to like think about all the groups that I'm really inspired by that do very like incredibly specific work that are answering calls. I mean, whether that's SEMA or the Beloved House in Asheville. Anytime a group springs up to step into a particular moment in history and address a certain need is, I mean, inspiring to all of us, and love to be a part and help out with those efforts wherever we can, and learn from them and walk with them as much as we can.
Well, we've been recording for about an hour and a half, so I don't know if you have any closing thoughts or things that we didn't cover yet that you really want to address.
I think maybe just a closing thought is that like a lot of this stuff is scary. Like I've had a long exposure to guns and tactical thinking and stuff like that, and I still find myself very scared in those moments. And being able to admit that and not internalize that is really important, and creating a culture around that is really important. And then the culture that we have developed as anarchists that I've seen around self-care, and not just individualizing self-care in this very capitalistic way, but like what that looks like dispersed across community, is something that we need to really be reinforcing within this type of praxis. And I think that our ability to move through fear and just to be brave in the moments that we find ourselves in is really necessary. And so as hard as it may be to like, especially with guns, to push beyond that level of fear, recognizing that if you have the ability to defend yourself or defend your community, that you should probably be thinking about that. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, echoing what said, learning how to sit with that fear and how uncomfortable all that stuff is I think really important to make sure this doesn't just make or create a left gun culture as we were talking about, or replicate a lot of the toxic masculinity or patriarchal structures that we should in this work all be wanting to destroy. I mean, I feel as though I appear incredibly comfortable with doing this work. After a long training weekend or after an action, I'm usually pretty messed up for several days after, because it's intense stuff, and if people can't respect that intensity, then and learn how to sit with it, I think maybe it's the wrong work to be doing. So going off that, fully consider the gravity and the weight of what you're doing, not just like historically, but what people are expecting you to do. This isn't theoretical. This isn't a game. If people make an ask of you or your crew to do this kind of work, meaning armed community defense, they are asking you to die or kill on their behalf, or save lives through medical care, whatever, and pretending that it's anything but that, and being unwilling to deal with that reality is doing yourself a disservice and your community a disservice. So be realistic about it, be smart, work really, really, really hard, train, and get the training, get your group competent before you go and offer assistance to people, would be my biggest thought.
And love each other. I think that's really important. So.
Actually, I did have one more question, if y'all can stand to continue. And this may be useful to answer, it may not be. But I'm curious, because there have been a couple of references already to Rojava. I think I read in Small Key Can Open a Large Door book a segment where they were talking about the internal dynamics of groups. I'm curious if y'all have any, since you seem to have a pretty tight crew, any insights into how to internally address problems in your group, into how to engage with concerns, or I'm kind of dancing around certain language right now. If there's any conflict resolution or any ways to sort of get around the traumas that can learn to process through the traumas that exist around community armed self-defense, working together as a group, loving each other, etc.
Yeah, I think accountability is something that we can always improve upon. And internally within our group, that is something that we struggle with. Personally, myself, I know I'm not very good at receiving critique. And so, honest about that, having my comrades, friends, know that and address that issue when that arises with me, and recognizing just that we do love each other, and we are trying to build the world together with each other. So that critique that comes is just a method of improvement on myself. I think that is really important. We don't have a process like Tech Mill, like they do in Rojava or anything like that, but we do have the relationships, I think, built to where we can address issues either one-on-one or mediated with each other in a way that is beneficial, and if not perfect in this moment, at least an attempt to move forward in that and to maintain that kind of stuff. And then also setting hard rules, we're not going to deal with abusers, and we're not going to allow toxic actions or people to remain in our groups, and being honest about that, I think, is really important. It's important in destroying any type of hierarchy that someone's ego can build, and then it's also just a way to keep us accountable to each other.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking back to when our group was a little bit more formalized after we had left the Redneck Revolt Network and still kind of had some of that structure. We had a lot of internal working groups that would handle stuff, and we had a conflict resolution working group. And I remember it became something of an inside joke, because at one given time, several of the members of the conflict resolution group were in conflict with people outside the conflict resolution working group. So it's so I guess my only point there, if there is one, is just that processes like that, if they're formalized to that degree, can sometimes hurt more than they help in making an unintentional power dynamic or hierarchy. Yeah, I think the term accountability gets used a lot and is used just as much to dodge the very thing it claims to provide. So I think allowing yourself to be vulnerable and being committed to yourself and self-improvement in terms of how to be a better friend, a better comrade, a better anarchist, human being, whatever, and being okay with your friends holding you accountable in the same light, barring serious instances of abuse and toxicity and that sort of thing. Your friends need to be similarly committed to the desire to work with you, if that is what they want, and on the same token, be committed to helping you in the process and building yourself up rather than tearing down. And this is very much not to be a confessional, but I had a really bad late summer and fall, and did a lot of stuff I should not have to people that I really care about, and handle myself in ways that were not awesome. And although it was really frustrating and it was probably the hardest time of my life, I couldn't have gotten through it without my comrades providing overlapping layers of support and love. Although many times it didn't feel like that, whether it was having a friend sit with you to do readings about toxic masculinity and figuring out what we learned from the texts, or having friends check in with you to make sure you're actually going to your therapy session, or having people be unafraid to call you in if you had done something that seemed like you were reverting back to previous behavior. Being okay with going through those long processes, even if they sometimes don't seem like formal processes, is the same as training how to use a gun. It's going to be a really long, intense process that requires a lot of work, and it's going to be embarrassing, humiliating, and difficult a lot of the time. But as long as the support network's there, I think we can use those processes to be better. Speaking specifically to things we do, something that I think is useful, and this is going to sound really weird, someone who describes themselves as an anarchist advocating a Maoist technique, but I actually find the process of criticism, self-criticism, to be very useful, as long as it's not done in a weird, culty, Maoist-y way. It's impossible because DSC, but I think after trainings or actions, having your affinity group sit around in a circle, and essentially everyone makes a statement like that, where they talk about something they could improve on, and something that they didn't quite like, they saw happen, and then ended on something that they really liked. I think that has a tendency to make people less likely to talk and bring up grievances right there in the moment, and that kind of heads off any kind of destructive backroom discussions that can really hurt someone's feelings or undermine a process later. So yeah, I think that's super effective, and something that I think AGs can play around with, making less culty, perhaps.
So I've really enjoyed this conversation with two local members of Red Guard.
Distracted people for.
This whole interview was a build-up to that joke, huh?
Are we Red Guard, Austin, Charlotte, or I think that's it.
Thank you so much, both of you, for having this conversation. I think it'll be really useful and edifying for the listening audience, and hopefully bring up...
Yeah, and thanks for all that you do, and we all do this now.
Thanks for listening to us ramble. Be good.
Or be good at it.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816.